This is the Business Edition with me, Tanya Beckett. The well runs dry. Oil giant BP is out of cash to compensate businesses in the Gulf of Mexico. British bank Barclays announces plans to raise $9 billion to meet tough new capital rules. And the US soldier who confessed to leaking hundreds of thousands of secret documents to WikiLeaks is found not guilty of aiding the enemy, but Bradley Manning will go to prison. Plus, a tight squeeze. We continue our series of reports about global housing by taking a look at the tiny spaces that some people reside in Hong Kong. Welcome once again. Well, we start with BP, which is struggling under the weight of claims from businesses in the Gulf of Mexico. The British oil giant says the fund it set aside to pay for those claims is running dry. BP had originally put aside $20 billion to cover damages caused by its disastrous spill in the Gulf of Mexico in 2010. But there is just $300 million left in the kitty, and the deadline for companies to file an economic loss claim isn't until next April. The situation has forced BP to increase its overall provision for the spill to $42.4 billion. But BP says that some of these claims are spurious, so it's set up a hotline for whistleblowers to give tip-offs about potentially fraudulent claims. The BBC's Mark Gregory reports.
BP's troubles began with a catastrophic explosion on one of its rigs in the Gulf of Mexico. The subsequent oil spill caused devastation along the southern coastline of the United States. BP put $20 billion into an independently managed trust fund to cover the cost of compensation for businesses. But the level of payouts has been far higher than the company expected, and BP now says all but $300 million of the money it set aside has been spent. BP says it's paid out vast sums for fictitious and inflated losses. But so far, US courts have rejected the company's efforts to change the terms on which it makes payments.
It's a difficult but probably realistic case of a foreign company caught up in a situation such as this, and I've seen quotes of American lawyers refer to it as a feeding frenzy in some cases, and I think that's very difficult for BP to fight against because not least of the political aspect to this in American domestic politics.
Analysts say BP is likely to emerge from the disaster as a radically changed business.
They're obviously going to be a smaller company than Prima Condo, and I think where they really focus is in the areas where they can generate good margins. Gulf of Mexico, North Sea, Angola, and then some of the new areas that they have been looking to more as exploration areas like India and Brazil, I think are where the future of the company is going to lie.
This is turning out to be one of the most expensive corporate disasters of all time, and the bills for BP are still coming in. Mark Gregory, BBC News.
With me now is Cornelia Meyer, the Chief Executive of Meyer Resources. Welcome. BP, from BP's point of view, it wants to try to put a lid on this, doesn't it? But it's difficult to know how to go about doing that.
It's very hard to do that because they have an agreement with the courts on how to calculate the claims. And that has given rise to what they call a lot of spurious claims, just with the methodology.
Right, but it's been to court to try to stop that happening, and it has not been successful. Indeed, it agreed with the court up front how it was going to compensate. So the court is not providing any respite from this.
No, and nor should they. And I think BP was wrong in terms of not negotiating harder, and Exxon would have negotiated a lot harder. But this being said, they had their backs against the wall.
Well, they did. Politically, they weren't in a very strong position. They weren't well loved at the time, were they?
Absolutely not.
Right, but the point is that BP can actually, looking at its balance sheet, afford this.
It can afford it. I think where it's bad for the share price is that investors that are looking for yield are very worried that any further claims will come out of the dividend, and they've just started paying a small dividend again. So investors looking for yield don't like it, and some other investors are worried that it takes up way too much management time.
And that, of course, one might see the effects of that further down the line if management is tied up, if funds are tied up, that it's not invested in exploration, for example.
But I think they've done a good thing in rejigging their portfolio. I mean, if they've invested something in 60 new upstream assets over the last year. So they have done a good job. They've done a good job in getting out of TNK-BP and getting into with Rosneft in Russia. So they have probably the most sizable assets in Russia of any oil company. So in that sense, they have done a good job, but it's all blighted a little bit by that whole brouhaha on the litigation, on the ongoing litigation.
It's a lesson hard learned, isn't it?
It's a lesson very hard learned, and it shows you that if you're an industrial company, it is, health and safety is important and process is terribly important.
Do you think, in terms of the internal operations of BP, that it is still recovering its confidence, its poise, if you like?
It is. I think it is. And anybody would be knocked. This was this was the biggest oil spill ever. It was a huge disaster. It has seen two managements. John Brown went before on other issues. Then Tony Hayward had, unfortunately, to leave. Now they're on the third management in a rather short time, and that is not easy for any company.
Thank you very much indeed, Cornelia Meyer.